Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed. Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into a really crucial topic today. We're looking at the potential ways the conflict in Ukraine might conclude, especially with all this talk about a possible high-level meeting gaining momentum. We've gathered insights that highlight 5 distinct scenarios for how this conflict could actually end. And interestingly, every single one is viewed as problematic for Kyiv. So our mission here is to unwrap each of these possibilities, understand the different perspectives, the different angles at play, and really try to grasp what these potential outcomes could mean.
Absolutely. And what's truly fascinating here, I think, is how these ongoing discussions, the talk around a potential meeting between U.S. President Trump and Russian President Putin, how that sets a very significant backdrop for considering these scenarios. It's not just about the outcomes themselves, what they might look like on paper, but also about the complex motivations driving these key players, what's pushing them towards or maybe even away from such a high-stakes meeting.
Right. So we've heard these whispers for a while now about a meeting between U.S. President Trump and Russian President Putin. Why is this conversation gaining so much traction right now? What's really behind it? What are the motivations?
Well, we can really identify 2 distinct sets of reasons that seem to be pushing this meeting into consideration at this specific moment.
Okay.
First, you have U.S. President Trump's motivation. He consistently aims to use what he sees as the unique strength of his personality to influence a deal, to broker some kind of arrangement.
A very personalized approach to diplomacy.
Exactly. He seems to genuinely believe that Moscow's unyielding stance, which has been, let's face it, quite evident and consistent over the past 6 months, that this stance could somehow be overcome by a direct face-to-face meeting with the Russian leader.
So just the power of personality cutting through the deadlock.
That seems to be the underlying belief. It's an approach rooted in this idea that personal chemistry, direct engagement, can somehow cut through established diplomatic impasses. U.S. President Trump appears to hold on to the belief that the Kremlin, despite its demonstrated resolve, can still be persuaded to cease military actions through this kind of direct, high-level interaction.
So it's about that direct appeal to overcome what he perceives as Moscow's inflexibility. But given the sheer complexity of this conflict, what are the risks? Relying solely on a personal touch in such high-stakes diplomacy.
Well, the risk, of course, is that such a personal approach might fundamentally misread the deep-seated strategic objectives of the other side. And if we look at Russian President Putin's perspective and strategy, it presents a very, very different picture.
How so?
He has recently articulated what's being called a maximalist position, essentially stating his most extreme, his most ambitious demands for the conflict's outcome.
Like what specifically?
He has repeatedly declared that Russians and Ukrainians are one people. And even more starkly, he said that wherever a Russian soldier steps, there is Russia. That kind of rhetoric sets a very clear, very uncompromising, and frankly, expansionist tone for any potential negotiations.
That's quite definitive.
It is. And furthermore, Russian President Putin appears to be playing for time. He seems to be leveraging the current dynamics on the battlefield. Just look back to May, for example. There was a proposal for an unconditional ceasefire put forward by Europe, the U.S., and Ukraine. Moscow flat out rejected it.
Rejected it entirely.
Entirely. Instead, what Russia offered were 2 unilateral, very brief, and ultimately ineffective pauses in fighting. They did very little to de-escalate the broader conflict. And right now, Russian forces are actively advancing on the front lines. They're engaged in a sustained summer offensive, an offensive that could bring President Putin significantly closer to his stated objectives, territorial control, political influence.
So the battlefield momentum is key for him.
Absolutely. The strong implication here is that if these advances continue, any negotiations that might happen in the autumn would take place in a completely different environment, an environment far more favorable to Russia, where they'd be negotiating from a position of much greater strength with solidified gains on the ground. So this suggests that for President Putin, time is currently on his side, and he aims to shift the diplomatic landscape through military action before seriously engaging in talks.
That makes a lot of sense tactically.
Yeah.
So if this high-stakes meeting does actually occur, what are the stated goals for each side? What do they truly hope to achieve by even sitting down, given these clearly very different approaches and timings?
Well, for America, the obvious stated objective would be to conduct a trilateral summit, meaning a meeting involving President Trump, President Putin, and Ukrainian President Zelensky.
All three leaders together.
Yes, specifically to discuss ending military operations. The aim would be a comprehensive resolution, ideally, with all the key parties directly at the table, ensuring Ukraine has agency in any negotiated settlement.
Okay, that sounds like the logical diplomatic goal from the U.S. perspective. What about Moscow's counterposition to that? Is Russia open to that kind of trilateral format, or do they have a different agenda entirely for a meeting with President Trump?
Well, that trilateral format is precisely what Russia rejected back in Istanbul in May.
Ah, okay, so that's already been turned down.
Yes. Moscow's likely aim for any meeting with U.S. President Trump wouldn't be to negotiate an immediate end to hostilities with Ukraine at the table. Instead, it would probably be to bring U.S. President Trump, quote, into the orbit of Russia's interpretation of events.
Into their interpretation, what does that mean practically?
It suggests a strong desire to directly influence the U.S. president's understanding of the conflict, perhaps to sow further discord within the Western alliances, and maybe, ultimately, to shift U.S. policy in a direction more aligned with Russia's interests. This approach would prioritize gaining U.S. understanding, perhaps even sympathy, for Russia's position, rather than engaging in a direct, multi-party negotiation focused on a comprehensive peace deal with Ukraine as an equal participant.
So it's more about shaping perceptions and potentially fracturing alliances than finding a joint solution with Ukraine involved.
That seems to be the underlying strategy. It's about shaping perceptions, potentially fracturing those alliances, yes.
It certainly sounds like a complex dance. Very different intentions for even holding the meeting. U.S. President Trump looking to leverage his personal influence for a deal, while Russian President Putin seems to be playing for time, seeking strategic advantage on the battlefield, aiming to reshape the negotiation landscape before any serious talks even begin. Okay, let's move on now to the core of our deep dive. These 5 possible scenarios for how this armed conflict might ultimately conclude.
Let's do that.
The information we have identifies 5 distinct scenarios, as we said, and the framing suggests they're all viewed as bad for Kyiv. That's a pretty stark assessment right from the outset. Let's break down each one, explore the details, the implications of each potential path.
And what's truly fascinating here, I think, is the sheer range of possibilities. You go from the highly improbable, almost wishful thinking, to the potentially catastrophic. And each one is driven by its own unique set of contributing factors, these incredibly complex dynamics, both on the ground and in the diplomatic circles.
Right. So let's start with scenario 1. This seems like the most straightforward, yet perhaps, as you indicated, the least likely option. Scenario 1. Russian President Putin agrees to an unconditional ceasefire. How is this described?
This scenario, it envisions President Putin agreeing to stop fighting unconditionally, with Russian forces leaving the front line essentially in its current state. Basically an immediate stop to hostilities where forces just stay put exactly where they are at that moment.
Just stop. Freeze in place. And what about its likelihood? Is this something considered a genuine possibility?
It's described in pretty stark terms, extremely unlikely.
Yeah.
Carrying very little chance of actually coming to fruition.
Extremely unlikely. Why so improbable?
Well, there are several compelling reasons. For one, as we mentioned, the U.S., Europe, and Ukraine collectively demanded just such a pause back in May. They even threatened further sanctions as leverage, but Russia explicitly rejected it then.
They already said no.
Correct. What's more, U.S. President Trump himself subsequently stepped back from that demand, instead favoring those low-level talks in Istanbul, which, as we know, yielded no significant results. We also saw that 30-day ceasefire earlier this year focused on energy infrastructure, but even that was only limitedly implemented. It didn't achieve any significant success in stopping the broader conflict or leading to any real de-escalation.
So past behavior is a strong indicator here.
It strongly suggests a lack of willingness from the Russian side to accept an unconditional halt. These past rejections and these very limited engagements really underscore Russia's unwillingness to simply halt operations without significant gains already secured.
Okay, so past behavior points away from this. But beyond those past rejections, what about the current battlefield dynamics? What's preventing this from happening now? Why wouldn't Russia agree at this moment?
Because the Kremlin is actively turning what it sees as gradual tactical successes on the battlefield into strategic advantages. Their offensive is currently in full swing, and from their perspective, they see absolutely no reason to stop now.
The momentum is with them, in their view.
That's the perception. This ongoing military momentum is a critical factor. For instance, even the threats of secondary sanctions against key economic partners like China and India, partners who appear, let's say, resistant to U.S. pressure. Even those threats aren't expected to change Russia's immediate military calculations for the remaining summer months.
These things aren't enough to deter them right now.
Not in the immediate term, it seems. The assessment is that President Putin wants to continue fighting at least until October because he is winning. The current military gains provide very little incentive for him to halt operations unconditionally.
Right. The core insight being, for a party that perceives itself as winning, negotiation is often a tactic to formalize gains, not to halt progress.
Exactly. Russia's rejection isn't just about playing for time, it's about demonstrating a fundamental redefinition of what negotiation means on their terms. It seems to mean consolidating what they've taken, solidifying those gains.
So given these battlefield realities, it really does sound almost unthinkable for Russia to consider a pause right now on these terms. It feels like they have absolutely no incentive to freeze the conflict in a state they see as unfavorable.
That's right. From Russia's perspective, an unconditional ceasefire at this stage would be akin to unilaterally giving up a perceived advantage. They just don't seem interested in freezing the conflict in a state that doesn't significantly benefit them.
Okay, extremely unlikely then. That brings us to our second scenario. If an unconditional ceasefire is effectively off the table, what does scenario 2, pragmatism and new negotiations, entail?
This scenario suggests a rather different path towards negotiations. It's one that would, in effect, solidify Russia's territorial gains by winter. The idea is the front line would be frozen both literally, by the onset of cold weather, and militarily, likely around October.
Frozen around October, so this isn't a peace agreement in the traditional sense.
No, not really. It's more like a strategic pause.
Yeah.
A de facto ceasefire dictated by battlefield realities and perhaps the changing seasons.
A strategic pause. What would be Russia's specific objectives and the potential outcomes if this scenario played out? What would they stand to gain?
Well, by October, President Putin might have achieved some key objectives in the east, potentially taking strategically important eastern cities such as Krasnoyarsk, also known as Pokrovsk, as well as Konstantinovka and Kupiansk.
And these aren't just small towns, are they?
No, not at all. To give a little context, Kupiansk, for example, is a critical railway hub. Control of it significantly impacts logistics. And both Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka are significant logistical and industrial centers in the Donbas region. Capturing these key urban centers would significantly strengthen Russia's military and strategic position. They'd control crucial supply lines, population centers.
Okay, so solidifying control over key infrastructure and territory.
Precisely. This consolidation of gains would allow them to regroup, potentially rearm, and effectively endure the winter. It cements their territorial control and allows their forces to rest and resupply for future operations.
And what happens after winter in this scenario?
Following the strategic pause, Russia could then potentially resume fighting in 2026, perhaps after a period of reevaluation and reinforcement. Alternatively, they could use diplomacy to try and make their achievements permanent, essentially trying to formalize the new front lines as de facto borders in any subsequent peace talks.
So using the pause to lock in gains, then decide whether to push further militarily or diplomatically.
Exactly. This scenario really reveals Russia's strategic patience, potentially, transforming tactical battlefield wins into long-term diplomatic leverage, effectively redrawing the map before any formal talks even begin in earnest.
Is there anything else Russia might try to leverage in this pragmatic negotiation scenario?
Yes, President Putin might also strategically raise the issue of elections in Ukraine. As we know, these elections have been delayed due to the ongoing conflict, and they have been a topic of discussion for U.S. President Trump as well.
How could Russia use the election issue?
They could use it as a diplomatic lever, perhaps questioning President Zelensky's legitimacy if elections aren't held under these difficult conditions, or even attempting somehow to influence the process to replace him with a more pro-Russian candidate. It's another way to try and shift the political landscape in Ukraine in their favor alongside the military gains.
So this scenario really isn't about a clean, definitive end to the conflict at all. It's much more a calculated strategic pause for Russia. about consolidating gains, preparing for future actions, whether military or diplomatic, and locking in advantages on the ground first.
That's precisely it. It would be a highly calculated move, leveraging current battlefield successes into long-term strategic benefits, giving Russia a much stronger hand in any future negotiations or indeed renewed military engagements. It buys them critical time to solidify their control and prepare for whatever the next phase might be.
Okay, very different dynamic. Now let's turn to scenario 3. This one sounds, well, maybe slightly less bleak for Kyiv, though still challenging.
Yeah.
Ukraine somehow survives the next 2 years. What does this survival scenario truly entail?
In this scenario, sustained American and European military aid becomes the absolute lifeline for Kyiv. This consistent flow of support is what enables Ukraine to minimize concessions on the front line in the coming months. It prevents a collapse, essentially.
So it's about holding the line.
Holding the line, yes. And this persistent external backing, it could eventually lead President Putin to seek negotiations, especially if his army falters in its objectives again, if they get bogged down, if the costs become too high. As we've seen happen in various instances throughout this conflict already, it's fundamentally a scenario of prolonged endurance for Ukraine.
So it's really about Ukraine's ability to hold the line, as you say, not necessarily advancing significantly, but preventing major further losses. What would Ukrainian defense capabilities and the Russian challenges look like in this situation?
Well, while key areas like Krasnoarmeysk or Pokrovsk might still fall, and other Ukrainian strongholds in the east could certainly be threatened, no doubt, Russia's advance could potentially slow down significantly.
Back to a war of attrition.
Potentially, yes. We've seen periods of stagnation in their offensive before. This scenario suggests a return to that kind of grinding, slower pace rather than rapid breakthroughs. And simultaneously, the Kremlin could begin to feel the deeper, more painful consequences of the international sanctions.
The economic pressure starting to bite harder.
Exactly. This could manifest as an overheated economy, where despite some initial resilience, the long-term strain of war production, isolation from markets, lack of access to technology, it starts to really bite, putting significant internal pressure on their capacity to sustain the conflict indefinitely.
So it becomes a grueling war of attrition for both sides, really. With economic pressure potentially becoming as important as military pressure on Russia, what kind of European support elements would be absolutely critical to enabling Ukraine's survival in this scenario? Is military aid enough?
Military aid is crucial, but European powers have also developed preliminary plans for something more, what they call support forces, to be deployed in Ukraine as part of broader security guarantees.
Support forces, what does that mean? Boots on the ground.
Well, yes, but importantly, these would not be token forces. They'd consist of potentially tens of thousands of NATO military personnel, primarily from various European countries. Their deployment would be strategic, likely around Kyiv and other major Ukrainian cities, away from the active front lines.
And their role, not combat, presumably.
Correct. Their roles would be largely non-combat. Key functions would include providing essential logistical support, which is vital, deep intelligence gathering and analysis, helping Ukraine's recovery efforts, crucial training as well. And, very importantly, they would act as a visible physical deterrent.
A tripwire force, in a sense.
In a way, yes. Their presence aims to prevent Moscow from attempting to change the current front line significantly, effectively solidifying the existing positions through a very visible international presence, signaling to Russia that further aggression would be met by a wider international commitment, raising the stakes considerably.
This sounds like a very long, drawn-out struggle then. Heavily reliant on consistent, extensive external backing. What is the overall outlook for Ukraine in this scenario? Is it sustainable?
This scenario is explicitly described as the best Ukraine can hope for.
The best they can hope for. That's sobering.
It is, and it's vital to understand that this is not a scenario of regaining significant lost territory. It's not about achieving an outright military victory in the conventional sense. Instead, it's about preventing a catastrophic collapse, preserving its sovereignty, maintaining a viable state, albeit under exceptionally challenging conditions and with extensive ongoing international assistance.
So it emphasizes sheer endurance.
Exactly. Endurance and consistent external support are the primary drivers of Ukraine's continued existence as a sovereign state in this picture. It's a grim form of success, perhaps, measured by avoiding defeat rather than achieving triumphs.
So definitely not a clear victory for Ukraine, but a grueling endurance contest, dependent entirely on consistent external support to prevent that collapse. It signifies a very long-term commitment from its allies, even if the front lines largely remain static or shift only incrementally?
That sums it up well. A long, hard slog sustained by outside help.
Okay, let's move to a much darker possibility now.
Yeah.
Scenario 4, catastrophe for Ukraine and NATO. So this sounds extremely serious.
It is. This is a truly dire scenario. It's one where Russian President Putin identifies and successfully capitalizes on perceived cracks in Western unity, perhaps following a meeting with U.S. President Trump, as mentioned earlier. This perception or reality of disunity could lead to improved U.S.-Russia relations on some level. And as a direct, devastating consequence, Ukraine being effectively abandoned to its fate by its key allies, particularly the U.S.
Abandoned. How would this Western disunity manifest itself on the ground? And what would its immediate and long-term consequences be for Ukraine's defenses, its very existence?
In this dire situation, Europe might do its absolute utmost to support Kyiv, pouring in resources, providing aid, but it would ultimately be unable to turn the tide of the conflict without robust, sustained American backing.
European support alone wouldn't be enough.
No. Without unified, decisive U.S. support, European efforts, however valiant, would simply be insufficient to prevent a strategic defeat for Ukraine. President Putin could then capitalize ruthlessly on this perceived Western weakness. He could escalate what might initially be minor successes in eastern Ukraine, pushing a few kilometers further into a slow, sustained defeat of Ukrainian troops.
A grinding advance.
Yes, likely across that flat, open terrain between the Donbass region and major central cities like Dnipro, Zaporizhia, perhaps even Kyiv again. That kind of terrain is notoriously difficult to defend against a numerically superior and well-supplied force, especially without air superiority.
And Ukraine's defenses?
They might prove alarmingly weak in the face of such a concentrated and sustained assault, particularly if Western supplies dwindle. A critical shortage of manpower in the Ukrainian armed forces could quickly spiral into a political catastrophe, forcing President Zelensky perhaps to call for an even larger, more comprehensive mobilization of his population, but possibly under immense pressure with dwindling public morale and maybe too little, too late.
A desperate situation.
Critically, Kyiv's security itself would again be jeopardized as President Putin's forces potentially advance deeper and deeper into Ukrainian territory, potentially threatening the capital itself once more, as they did early in the conflict.
That paints a really chilling picture of cascading failures, where one setback just leads to another, accelerating Ukraine's decline. What would be the European dilemma in this? And NATO's response if this tragic scenario unfolds?
European countries would find themselves caught in an incredibly difficult, almost impossible position. Logically, strategically, they might consider it preferable to fight Russia and Ukraine, essentially containing the conflict there, rather than later having to confront Russia directly on European Union territory, which would obviously be far more devastating.
The strategic rationale is clear, better there than here.
Right. The strategic rationale would be to prevent the conflict from spreading to their own borders. However, and this is the crucial point, despite this clear strategic preference, European leaders ultimately lack the political authority to enter the war for Ukrainian territories.
They don't have the mandate for direct intervention.
Exactly. They would be severely constrained from direct military intervention or deploying large combat forces to prevent further Ukrainian losses on their own. They simply don't have the unified political will or perhaps the independent military capability on that scale for such a drastic step without the U.S. fully committed. So, as President Putin continues his relentless advance in this scenario, NATO, potentially crippled by this perceived Western disunity and the lack of clear American leadership, would likely be unable to provide a unified, decisive response. This would lead to a profound crisis within the alliance itself, questioning its very purpose, its credibility, its effectiveness.
A crisis for NATO itself. And what would be the ultimate devastating outcome of such a scenario for Ukraine and for Europe?
It's starkly characterized as a nightmare for Europe, and even more starkly as the end of sovereign Ukraine. It would represent a fundamental, catastrophic shift in the regional power balance, demonstrating a failure of collective security, a severe blow to international law and sovereign integrity. It implies a return to a much more dangerous, much more unstable geopolitical landscape in Europe.
A truly bleak outlook.
It really underscores the critical role of sustained and unified Western support, particularly from the U.S. The integrity of the alliance and the unwavering commitment of its most powerful members are absolutely central to preventing such a catastrophic outcome.
A sobering reminder of the stakes. Okay, let's move to the final scenario, scenario 5. This one presents a really stark contrast to the others. It posits that Russia's own internal dynamics and military overextension could actually be its undoing. Catastrophe for Russian President Putin. How is this described? It mentions Afghanistan.
Yes, it draws that parallel. In this scenario, Russia commits a major strategic error, essentially sacrificing thousands of soldiers' lives weekly, month after month, for relatively minor tactical gains. It's not necessarily a sudden collapse, but a slow, agonizing bleed. A protracted conflict without significant strategic returns, becoming an unsustainable drain on Russian resources and manpower.
Like getting stuck in a quagmire. What internal and external pressures would build on Russia to lead to this kind of self-inflicted strategic undoing?
Well, on the external front, the cumulative impact of sanctions could begin to truly undermine Russia's key relationships, potentially weakening its alliance or partnership with China, reducing Beijing's willingness perhaps to provide significant economic or political support if Russia looks like a losing bet. Simultaneously, it could deprive Russia of crucial trade revenues from countries like India, which have been something of a lifeline during Western sanctions, if those dry up.
So key partnerships fraying. What about economically, internally?
Economically, Moscow's sovereign wealth fund reserves, initially quite robust, could be depleted significantly. Its overall state revenues might fall drastically as global energy markets continue to shift, or perhaps as Western sanctions enforcement tightens even further, closing loopholes. Internally, you could see the Moscow elite, those powerful figures within the government, security services, business, begin to express significant disagreement, dissent. Disagreement with the Kremlin's persistent rejection of diplomatic off-ramps or face-saving exits.
Especially if the war keeps dragging on without clear wins.
Precisely. This dissent would become particularly pronounced if Russia continues its military persistence in what is essentially a proxy conflict with NATO, a conflict that the elite might come to believe Russia simply cannot sustain in the long run, economically or militarily. Politically, there's another factor. If U.S. President Trump were to become a lame duck.
Meaning after losing an election or being unable to run again?
Yes. If his political leverage diminishes, his focus perhaps shifts away from singular grand deals, U.S. foreign policy could potentially revert to more traditional norms. Norms of opposing both Moscow and Beijing, especially after midterm elections perhaps. This would effectively remove a potential avenue for favorable negotiations for Russia, increasing their isolation.
So it's a potent combination. Deepening economic strain, rising internal dissent among the powerful, and a potential negative shift in international relations. What would be the tipping point for the Kremlin in this scenario? The moment when this denial of reality becomes unbearable?
The Kremlin's fundamental unwillingness potentially to acknowledge uncomfortable reality, its persistent denial of the true costs, the actual state of the war, the human toll, combined with increasing economic hardships felt by the ordinary Russian people, that could eventually turn against the regime. This denial of grim realities, coupled with widespread popular discontent stemming from economic struggles and a high casualty rate, that could become a powerfully destabilizing force, undermining the regime's authority from within.
And that's where the historical parallel comes in, the Afghanistan comparison you mentioned.
Exactly. This situation is explicitly likened to the mistaken political calculation that led to the fruitless Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. That decade-long conflict from 79 to 89, though very different in context, ultimately proved militarily unsustainable and economically crippling for the Soviet Union. It's widely seen now as a significant contributing factor to the Soviet Union's eventual decline and collapse. It serves as a stark historical warning against prolonged military overextension based on fundamental misjudgments of cost and feasibility.
And we've actually seen moments of unexpected weakness or perhaps fragility from the Kremlin during this current conflict in Ukraine, haven't we?
Indeed. The analysis notes that moments of unexpected Kremlin weakness have already occurred, citing most notably that brief but incredibly significant military march towards Moscow by Yevgeny Prigozhin and his Wagner forces last year.
That was extraordinary.
It was. That incident, though short-lived, demonstrated a surprising fragility, a vulnerability perhaps, beneath the surface of apparent strength and centralized control within the Russian system.
So what's the ultimate outlook for President Putin himself in this scenario if all these pressures converge, if this catastrophe unfolds for Russia?
Well, while President Putin may project an image of undeniable strength and absolute control, at some point he could be exposed as critically weak, revealing what's termed a critical infirmity, a fundamental weakness.
And this isn't unprecedented.
No, it has happened before, not only with the apparently monolithic expansionist Soviet Russia, but arguably even with President Putin himself at specific junctures where his authority seemed less absolute than portrayed. Now, this scenario, self-inflicted collapse due to overreach and internal pressures, it remains, interestingly, the greatest hope for Western strategists.
That greatest hope, why is that?
Because, realistically, these strategists cannot definitively count on NATO's actual direct entry into the war to help Ukraine win. That carries immense escalation risks. Nor can they necessarily rely solely on Kyiv's ability to repel Moscow militarily in the long run without massive, unending external support. Therefore, a self-inflicted Russian collapse, however uncertain or potentially chaotic it might be, is viewed as perhaps the most plausible path, from their perspective, to a favorable outcome for the West and for Ukrainian sovereignty, without direct great power conflict.
Fascinating. This scenario truly presents a stark contrast then, positing that Russia's own internal dynamics and overextension could ultimately be its undoing. A situation where its own actions lead to its strategic weakening and potential defeat from within.
A very different pathway to a conclusion, certainly.
Okay, we've gone through all 5 scenarios now. Let's try to bring this together.
All right. Ultimately, the analysis we've explored concludes that all 5 of these potential options, every single one, is seen as bad for Ukraine.
All 5 are bad for Kyiv. That's the bottom line assessment.
That's the assessment presented. None of them present an unequivocally positive or victorious outcome for Kyiv in the traditional sense, which really highlights the immense challenges Ukraine faces regardless of how this conflict evolves in the coming months or years.
And is there any scenario that represents a more definitive outcome regarding Russia's power?
Yes, only one of these scenarios, the 5th one we discussed, the catastrophe for Russian President Putin, would truly signify a de facto defeat of Russia as a military power and a threat to European security. That's the sole path discussed here that leads to a significant systemic reduction of Russia's regional power and influence, rather than merely a cessation of hostilities, a frozen conflict, or even a negotiated settlement that leaves Russia largely intact.
So only the internal collapse scenario truly diminishes Russia as a major power in this analysis.
According to this perspective, yes. And there's one final critical point that's made. None of these outcomes, whether perceived as good, bad, or indifferent for Kyiv, are expected to arise from a one-on-one meeting between U.S. President Trump and Russian President Putin if Ukraine is not a direct participant in any future deal.
Ukraine must be at the table for any meaningful resolution.
That's the strong emphasis. It highlights the vital necessity of Ukraine's presence, its agency, its voice in any negotiations, truly aimed at resolving the conflict in a way that respects its sovereignty and determines its future. Bypassing Kyiv won't lead to any of these end states, is the argument.
This deep dive has truly revealed an incredibly complex web of possibilities, where the strategic choices made by leaders, the sheer resilience of forces on the ground, the unity or disunity of international alliances, all could shift the scales dramatically. The future remains deeply uncertain, of course. But understanding these potential paths, these scenarios, helps us grasp the immense stakes involved. And perhaps it helps us understand what might be necessary to navigate towards less damaging outcomes. Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We're here to make things clear, new episodes every day.